You've got it. You better stop it. Ooh. You've got it. You've got it.
On this episode of the Ready State Podcast, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Heather Sandison. Dr. Sandison is the New York Times bestselling author of Reversing Alzheimer's, the new toolkit to improve cognition and protect brain health. She is a renowned naturopathic doctor specializing in neurocognitive medicine and the founder of Solcere Health Clinic, San Diego's premier brain optimization clinic, and Marama, a residential program turning memory care into memory recovery. She has dedicated her career to supporting those suffering with dementia and is the primary author of peer-reviewed research published in the Journal of Alzheimer's Disease. She is excited to shatter common misconceptions about Alzheimer's and share what she has learned about keeping your brain sharp at any age. You know, I actually was not familiar with Dr. Sandison's work until like maybe the last 6 months or something. And her appearance on a couple podcasts popped into my Instagram feed. And I'll be honest, I actually had no idea that there was even someone out there or a group of people out there that were actually talking about reversing Alzheimer's.
Yeah.
Like that kind of blew my mind. Like I, of course, have, you know, in our space talked to a lot of people. We had Dr. Tommy Wood on our podcast about brain health and how you can hopefully prevent Alzheimer's, but never anyone actually talking about the possibility of reversing Alzheimer's.
I think one of the things that it's easy to not extend the courtesy to around the brain is that the brain can heal, that the brain can remodel itself. And at no age, no kind of ability does your body stop trying to remodel itself and move towards kind of greater capacity. It's a lot of work, and we have to be consistent about some really fundamental behaviors. But it's pretty remarkable what her research is showing and what her sort of clinical outcomes are when we begin to say, what are first principles and how do we integrate that? And it really can mean significant changes in people's quality of their life, their quality of their relationships with their loved ones. And I love that because sometimes, you know, people come to us with real gnarly musculoskeletal problems that we can't back out of. But by improving the system, just not automatically saying this is a one-way street, people get so much life back.
Yeah. And I feel like, you know, my own grandfather had Alzheimer's, and I think so many people listening to this podcast know someone in their, you know, immediate or extended family that's been impacted by, you know, what I think for many people is like one of the scariest diseases to get is to sort of like lose your mental acuity as you age. I think it's a really frightening prospect. So to learn a bunch of actionable things you can do now to limit the chances that you're going to, you know, come down with this terrible disease, and that there's actually work being done around reversing and improving it for people who already have it. Like this is amazing. And, you know, we were really, really blown away by her.
And her point, I just want to wrap up, is that even if you're genetically predisposed for having the sequela of issues that ends with you sort of having an Alzheimer's diagnosis, doesn't mean that it's a guarantee that you have to have all of these symptoms of this gnarly disease.
Yeah. So please, everybody, enjoy this sort of mind-bending episode with Dr. Heather Sandison. Dr. Heather, welcome to the Ready State Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a privilege to be here with you.
So we are so excited to talk to you about a variety of different things, but primarily your book, Reversing Alzheimer's, and all of your work around this, I think, really important topic. And I can say for Kelly and I that we have a set of aging baby boomer parents that are starting to roll into their 80s, and certainly Alzheimer's is a concern. My own grandfather had Alzheimer's, and I think, you know, there's probably everyone listening to this podcast either has someone in their family who's been affected by it, or at least in their sort of close circle. So I just want to start by saying I am really excited to have this conversation with you and delighted you're on. And I'll just start by saying, you know, how did you start doing this work, and maybe introduce yourself a little bit in terms of what your professional background is to our audience, to the extent they aren't already familiar with your work.
Sure. So I went to naturopathic school. I came to the West Coast for undergrad thinking I would go to UCSF, the best medical school on the West Coast, and do conventional medicine. And then through my own kind of health issues that came up during undergrad, I was really drawn to the more complementary, alternative, holistic medicine. And I ended up getting help from an osteopathic physician who suggested I look into going to Bastyr and look into going to naturopathic school. And this really aligned for me because the orientation is towards health rather than disease medicine. And also the tool belt. I was really intrigued by the tool belt of naturopathic medicine, that it wasn't just medications and surgeries. It was really thinking through what for a complex system is going to support the health of the organism, right? Whether it's diet or sleep or exercise, all of the things, the inputs and the outputs that make us who we are and really impact how healthy we live our lives and how healthy we age ultimately. So in naturopathic school, I heard the refrain over and over again: never suggest that you can do something for someone with Alzheimer's. There's nothing you can do. It's a downhill slope. And to suggest that we could help those people is to give them false hope and to do harm. So fast forward several years out of school, I was listening to a talk at a conference by my mentor now, Dr. Dale Bredesen, and he said exactly the opposite. He said, there is a ton we can do for Alzheimer's. And essentially what he was suggesting was that if we packaged naturopathic medicine, functional medicine to support patients dealing with age-related memory loss, we could get improvement. And this blew my mind, and I was very skeptical. But the way he described it conceptually, philosophically, it's like, this makes sense. This is common sense. If we do everything we can to support the health of the neurons and we take out all the junk that is going to lead them towards neurodegeneration, dysregulation, dysfunction, then we should get healthier, better functioning neurons. And what we see is that that plays out in the symptomology, that people improve their cognition. So when he said that, I double clicked, went and did his training. And then I was the only person in San Diego who had been trained by him right as his New York Times bestselling book, The End of Alzheimer's, was published. And there was a lot of momentum around that. So patients were coming in to me, families, couples, parents with their children, their adult children, were coming into me with a lot more confidence than I had, which was good because I was like, I still don't think I can help you, but I'll go through the motions of what Dr. Bredesen said. It kind of makes sense. I just haven't ever seen it work. So I'm going to not hold my breath. And then people came back better. And not just once or twice, but over and over, and not just a little bit better, but dramatically better. And when I saw the first patient, she came in with a MoCA score of 2. So MoCA is the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, which is a blunt instrument, but it's a tool to kind of give us a number of where someone is on the spectrum of cognitive decline. So 26 and above is normal. Once you start going towards 0, it's indicating more progression of the disease process. And 30 is normal, is perfect, right? It's a one-page worksheet that takes about 20 minutes. If you have more cognitive decline, it can take a little longer. But basically, this is proctored by someone who's trained. And you identify zoo animals, draw a clock, say where you are in time and space. And at the end of that, you get a point, a score. And so she had a MoCA score of 2. She basically could answer questions with yes and no. And I did not think I could help her. She came back 6 weeks later. We went through the motions. Again, her husband was very committed. It's so sweet. The partners of my patients are so inspiring and so dedicated. And so they're just pioneers doing the hard work. And she came back with a MoCA score of 7 just 6 weeks later. She was speaking in full sentences. They were bickering about things that had happened. Their lives had transformed. They were ballroom dancing 3 times a week. They were eating much better. They had moved out of a moldy bedroom and actually moved into their living room where they weren't exposed to those toxins. She had gotten on bioidentical hormone replacement. She had gone to the dentist. She was on all the supplements that we had talked about. And their lives had measurably, profoundly changed. Now, she wasn't going back to work, but their quality of life, the quality of life for both of them, had improved dramatically, and we had reduced the suffering associated with this awful disease. And when I saw that, I remember the day that we saw this improvement in her MoCA score, and at first I thought I had done it wrong, right? I was like, maybe this isn't supposed to be able to happen, so I must have not done this right. And then when I realized her husband was like, no, this is happening. This is real. Life is different. And then, of course, the next place I went was, if this is possible for her, what about everybody else? How many people are suffering unnecessarily? And then how many people will listen to me, right? I need to tell everyone that we can do this.
Amazing. I have several friends who are graduates from Bastyr. And what's so interesting is that those practitioners have been touting what we're now calling lifestyle medicine, in sort of the Western allopathic world of, hey, looking at diet and sleep, and that we are a complex system, and what are the essentials. But I feel like my Bastyr friends are like, yeah, you've got to be on this for a long time, thinking in a much more systems approach. And it's interesting. When this person came to you, I assumed that they had been under traditional care, and that sometimes it's not necessarily that the traditional care is nefarious, of course, but that we just don't have a great set of tools or even the time or the structure to really get in to ask about the sleep, to ask about the setup. We're not set up for that. And a different practitioner, suddenly you're like, well, any one of these things may not make a difference, but all of these things combined really does support the longevity of the human. And I almost feel like we're into a conversation about longevity and durability and aging, the decline that sometimes we see in cognition is not just a given. Am I right about that?
Absolutely. I would say that the decline we see with aging is not a given, we do not have to have that expectation. The work of Becca Levy, she wrote Breaking the Age Code. She's at Yale. She has shown that people who have a positive association with aging do not drop in cognition. And they can even negate, if you have this optimistic view of where life is going, even as you enter that last chapter of it. I think of channeling my inner Betty White, like, right, life just keeps getting better and better and funnier and more amusing. The connections keep getting better. And when we can do that, you can actually reverse the increased risk associated with the ApoE4 genetics that put people at higher risk for both cardiovascular disease and dementia. So there is a lot of power in how we think through what that last chapter, that last quarter of life looks like. And the whole it's this complex system science approach. It's not the reductionistic single molecule intervention that so many of us want to put our complex diseases into that box. It would be so much easier if you could show up in the conventional system, have your insurance pay for it, have it take 7 minutes for a doctor to write the prescription and be done, right? I would love if that worked. And yet what we see is that over and over again, when we try to put Alzheimer's into that box, it just doesn't fit. We need a complexity to our approach in order to get a solution, right? It has to match the complexity of the disease process.
So before, I have about 1,000 questions about the reversing
Jill and I are
Alzheimer's part.
knocking each other under the table. Who's going to be next?
Before we get to that, I would almost love to sort of like go back to basics a little for people listening. And maybe if you could tell us, what do we know now scientifically about the causes of Alzheimer's to begin with? Because I would love to talk about that. And then, and then just to set this up a little bit, we obviously we ourselves are 51 years old. We think a lot of our audience is between like 40 and 70. So this is a group of people who are interested in longevity and definitely interested in trying to prevent Alzheimer's
And
if
take
they
care of their
can,
parents.
and take care of their parents if they have them. But I guess I would love to just sort of go back to the real basics. Like, what do we know now about the causes of Alzheimer's? Like, as an example, I've heard that a lot of people consider Alzheimer's to be, they've referred to it as type 3 diabetes as an example. But again, I don't know a ton. And
Define some terms for us, would you?
What do we know?
Yeah, great. So I want to first compare it to the conventional kind of framework, right? This idea that a single molecule can help us if we get rid of the beta amyloid, right? Beta amyloid and tau proteins, these misfolded proteins, have been sort of the go-to scapegoat. Like, this is the cause of Alzheimer's. And what we see over and over again in the literature is when we can get rid of the amyloid, we can do that with the medications, but we don't improve cognition. In the best case scenario, what we do is we slow the rate of progression, and yet there's a 3 to 4-fold increase in death. That data was recently reanalyzed, and we see that actually increases the risk of death when we use those medications. We see brain atrophy with those medications. We see that there's brain bleeding and brain swelling, so they come at a very high risk, and you don't get an improvement in cognition. And so also with beta amyloid, what we see is that there are people who have lots of beta amyloid, but not the cognition issues, right? They still have good cognition. And then we see people who have poor cognition, who don't have a ton of beta amyloid, but might get an Alzheimer's diagnosis. So, and that's changing. There's a lot of diagnostics that are changing very rapidly right now. But in that sort of conventional perspective, the idea was that if we got rid of the amyloid, if you were studying amyloid, you were studying Alzheimer's. And if you got rid of the amyloid, we could solve this problem. And yet that has not played out. What we see is that when we use this complex system science approach, when you mentioned is Alzheimer's type 3 diabetes. So it's one of the reasons. But when people arrive at a diagnosis of age-related memory loss, right? Whether it's Alzheimer's or another type of dementia, there are multiple paths that we can take to get there. Now, amyloid is related to Alzheimer's. There's no question about that. However, if we say amyloid is the cause and we don't take the opportunity to say what caused the amyloid, why is there amyloid, then we miss the opportunity to say, okay, what really triggered this neurodegenerative pathway? And
like what's the actual root cause?
Exactly. My music to my ears. So the way that I've broken it down, because it can feel overwhelming, right? Like, how do I organize myself? So the way that I think through it is that there's 6 components of brain health. And what we're looking for from a complex system science perspective, we're looking for dysregulation. We're looking for imbalance, too much, too little, in the wrong place at the wrong time, in these 6 areas that are at the causal level. So 1 is toxicity, 2 is nutrients, 3 is stress, 4 is structure, 5 is infections, and 6 is signaling. And when we can break any of those down, but what I want to do whenever I approach a patient, whenever I'm talking to someone about this, is we want to understand what's the smoking gun, because it might be type 3 diabetes, right? It might be glycotoxicity. It might be insulin resistance, and that we're not getting enough resource in our brain because we're not turning glucose into fuel. That might be true for one person, but it might be traumatic brain injuries, genetic risk, sleep apnea for another person who has very well controlled blood sugar, right? So it's not always that high blood sugar. We want to think through this systematically to know for you precisely what is putting you at risk.
Amazing.
How important is it that when we are talking about our family members or ourselves, that we differentiate Alzheimer's as a process from age-related cognitive change?
Yeah, or just dementia. Like, what is the difference?
I certainly at age 51 maybe feel, half percentage less sharp than sometimes I did when I was like a laser riding a shark on some rails. But, is that an important distinction? Because ultimately I feel like, one is that we've learned that the brain is capable of remodeling and changing itself and healing itself. That's a new concept in the last decade for sure. But 2, doesn't it seem like all of the behaviors that we should be engaging with, feeling loved, getting nutrients, sunlight, play, learning new skills, those are the recipes for being a really great human. So is it that if I haven't done those things and I end up starting to see this, that I can maybe turn those small hinges to swing bigger sort of cognitive doors? Or is it that I'll just ameliorate some of my risk, that because genetics eventually for my family, I'm going to be facing more cognitive decline with age anyway?
Yeah. So what we see, like in Becca Levy's work, you can negate the genetic risk by pulling on these levers that increase or decrease your risk, right? To hopefully decrease, hopefully we're pulling on them in every way that we can to decrease your risk. And if you are someone with genetic risk for Alzheimer's, so APOE is one of the genetics. It's a single nucleotide polymorphism. It's a relatively inexpensive test to do. And 10 years ago, people would have said, I don't want to know. And it's just going to give me anxiety if I know that I have increased risk because this is inevitable. Well, now we know that there are so many things that you can do to negate your risk and to mitigate your risk. And so I want everyone to know, in utero or soon after, if they have risk for dementia or Alzheimer's, because then as they go through their teenage years, as they go through their 20s, we want to make sure that they get better sleep, that they're not pulling all-nighters. We want to make sure that they're getting better nutrients. We might have to work harder than our neighbors or our spouses, people that we aren't genetically related to. But then we can be empowered to go through this. My mentor, Dr. Bredesen, he calls it a cognoscopy, right? So just like you get a colonoscopy, you want to reduce your risk of getting colon cancer. You want to look for those pieces that you have control over. So when we think through Alzheimer's, and dementia. So dementia is the umbrella term under which includes Alzheimer's, frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body dementia, posterior cortical atrophy. There's a bunch of different types of dementia. And what this is referring to is more or less the pathophysiology. In what way is the brain changing kind of when you look under the microscope? And for me, the much more important conversation, the much more important question to ask, rather than the ICD-10 diagnosis that gets sent to the insurance company for billing purposes, is why? Why is there neurodegeneration taking place? And that goes back to those 6 causal components of brain health. And so what I want to know is, yes, if there's 2 buckets, right? There's the things that you have control over and the things that you don't have control over. I cannot change the genetics you were born with. I cannot change the sex you were born with. I cannot change the year you were born. But I can pull every lever possible to make sure that your biological age is less than your chronological age, that your cells are aging at a rate that is optimized.
So the genetic test that you mentioned, can you remind me of the name of it again?
Yeah, it's ApoE, as in elephant.
ApoE. Okay. And the reason I wanted to mention it is I assume many people listening to this have done their 23andMe or some other kind of genetic test. And I think sometimes those tests fall flat because you get all this data and you don't really know what to do with it, and there's nothing actionable, or maybe like in the case of Parkinson's, you just don't even want to know, right? But listening to this, that you actually can at least, potentially prevent, if not reduce your chances significantly of having this kind of decline, it might be interesting for people to go back and dig out those results and sort of see what they're dealing with, right? And I don't think that necessarily should change, because I think anyone listening to this, I would assume, does not want to experience any kind of, neurodegeneration and is motivated to try to take steps to not experience that. So anyway, go back and look at your 23andMe, everybody, if you have that, and that should be sitting in there. And then I guess my question is, you've hinted at a few things, sleep and, eating nutrients, but for the 40, 50 longevity set listening to this, what are the sort of, greatest hits of things they should be thinking about doing now as they age, to sort of make sure they don't fall into that bucket of people that have this kind of decline?
And let me add that, are we seeing an increase in some of these neurodegenerative diseases because we're seeing an erosion or a change in some of our fundamental biological behaviors?
Yes, without a doubt. And also the demographic shift, right? Baby boomers are approaching this age where they are at the highest risk. So there's this massive part of our population that is in that category where this happens. But it's also happening younger. People are having cognitive decline that's starting in their 40s and 50s, that's impairing their ability to work, raise their kids, right? It's happening younger. And I think that a lot of that has to do with environmental factors and food, and stress and lots of other things that are we weren't designed to live in the society that we live in today, right? With the screens and the stress and the amount we work and how little we move. And so let's go into that. Instead of being negative about it, though, I'd love to go into okay,
because we can play offense here.
Yeah.
That MoCA score, bring us back up to 30.
Yeah.
So I really feel like that's the message here, is that it's not doom and gloom. We're just holding back the dike, right? We've got our fingers in the dike. We actually can play a lot of offense because the brain is capable of changing.
Yeah. And just one quick thing I'll say I mean, we had one of my favorite books of all time is this book called Spark by John Rady, a Harvard professor. And that was sort of the first time I realized, I read this book back in like 2011 or something. And, his whole thing is that like exercise is miracle grow for the brain. But that was one of the first times I was like, oh, we can grow the brain and heal the brain. And then we had Dr. Tommy Wood on our podcast as well, talking about all things brain health. And, it just seems to really be lining up that there are a lot of ways we can play offense and a lot of ways we can grow and change our brain even as we age.
And I would invite listeners to think through, okay, where is it, as I talk through these are not going to be new things, right? This is common sense, just uncommon practice. And I know that your listeners are into exercise. They've heard about hormones. They've heard about lots of these things already. And so I would invite you to kind of double click on the one where you feel like there's the most delta, right? There's the most room for improvement.
I like that.
And that can be the best place to start, right? It's not about being perfect. It's not about doing every single one of these things, but where are you going to get the most benefit? And go there. So let's chat through these. So toxins, I think of in 3 flavors. Typically, you work with a functional medicine provider, a past year grad, a naturopathic doctor, and you can look for heavy metals. So we know that mercury, lead, arsenic, these are directly neurodegenerative. If we know that they're there, we can get rid of them. If we don't know that they're there, we're less likely to be doing that. So we want to look for them. Mycotoxins or mold toxins, these come from water damaged buildings. Again, directly neurotoxic. They reduce immune function. They're carcinogenic. So we want to be looking for these things. And then third are the chemical toxins. Glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, directly neurotoxic. And if we know it's there, we can do things, we can make decisions to reduce that risk. Parabens, phthalates, PCBs, petrochemicals, pesticides, herbicides, these are ubiquitous in our environment. We can't avoid all of them. But when we know that they're there, we can make behavioral changes, we can reduce our risk, and we can also do things like open up our emunctories, is a fancy word we use in naturopathic medicine for organs of elimination. We can make sure that we are peeing, pooping, sweating, and breathing and get that stuff out, keep it moving so it's not accumulating in the brain and elsewhere. So toxins, that's something that we want to be aware of that are directly neurotoxic. They can directly lead to changes in the brain, particularly Parkinson's is associated ALS. These neurodegenerative diseases are linked to these toxic exposures and accumulation. So that's one.
This episode of the Ready State Podcast is brought to you by our friends at Element.
We are deep into cold season.
Winter.
And I want to remind people that your Element works amazing in the summer, but is just as hardworking in the winter. Making hot Element is the easiest way to drink all your water during the day.
Yeah, and actually absorb the water you're drinking, which I think is a key reason that we love Element so much, is that we know that rather than just peeing out all the water we're drinking, we're going to absorb it.
Well, the chances are you're drinking a lot of water and you probably don't have a lot of salt with that water, right?
Yeah.
Or you're not eating it with food. We see regularly people trying to improve their health. They're just chugging water and peeing all the time. And I'm like, I wonder why that's happening.
Yeah.
One of the things that makes a difference, I'm coaching a lot outside these days, and I make myself a big jug of warm Element, and I'm just crushing it. I am so happy. I'm warm on the inside. Amazing.
Forget about your coaching outside. For those who may not know, our Ready State office is basically the coldest place on earth without any heat. And so we actually survive the winter here at the Ready State by drinking hot Element.
I know I have like this Yeti bottle with this little metal top, and I just I'm like my grandfather drinking like bourbon and tea out of that thing, except it's hot Element. So it's Lisa approved. If you want to learn more and order a free sample pack with Element's flavors, go to our link, drinklmnt.com/TRS. And remember, you can always go sparkling.
The sparkling is so good, you guys. If you haven't tried it yet, go get some.
We literally drink it every day.
True fact. This episode of the Ready State Podcast is brought to you by Momentus. And in honor of having Dr. Heather Sandison on and talking a lot about brain health, the product that we want to talk about today was the awesome omega-3s.
Yeah, we have talked about omega-3 as part of our stack, right? We take creatine, we get enough protein, and we take omegas. Yeah. And one of the things that our family is not good at is eating fish.
Yeah, we're not
sardines.
Super fishy people.
And Caroline, hell no.
Yeah.
So one of the things that happens is she's figured out she can take her omegas at night. And I think we lost track of why we were taking omegas. It was about inflammation in the 2000s, right? Got to not be inflamed. And then we're like, it's heart health. But it turns out DHA and brain health is pretty radical concept.
Yeah, and this omega supplement is sourced from anchovies, sardines, and mackerel that contain way lower levels of heavy metals, which is important, and also without the fishy aftertaste.
Yeah.
For those of us who don't love fish, like me, that's pretty critical. Because
And when you look at the kind of critical ingredients in the Momentus Omegas, you would have to take like 15 fish oil pills from Costco, which is like nightmare.
No,
That's a
no,
nightmare.
thank you. No, thank you.
This study that we really kind of highlighted in the recent ambush was that red blood cell DHA levels is inversely associated with the risk of incident Alzheimer's disease. And that was in Framingham.
Lower incident of Alzheimer's
Yeah,
disease.
that's right.
Yeah.
So the idea here is we have to protect the brain. This
Yeah.
is such an easy, high quality thing.
Yeah.
And I will run this thing, these omegas, on black coffee, exercise, empty stomach, because I'm like, I don't believe you that it's no burps.
Yeah.
No burps.
Yeah. And I mean, honestly, any supplement that's going to help support our brain function and brain health, like we are all in.
I'm going to be 130 years old, bro.
Yeah, because we want to be 130 and we're already 51.
If you want to get 20% off your first purchase, go to livemomentus.com/TRS.
So quick practical side on this, if you want to learn whether you have any of these metals in your body, you would need to go get tested. So I'll just start by saying that. But then as far as these sort of broad environmental chemicals, I mean, I think that can be overwhelming to people and impossible to avoid on many levels. But like, what are one or two things that, is it just as like simple as like, don't microwave plastic, or like, what are one or two like obvious things that everybody could do that might make a difference and at least sort of reduce that load?
Yeah, so indoor air quality is not particularly good, especially compared to outdoor air, fresh air. So opening doors and windows for 1 to 2 hours a day, the solution to pollution is dilution, right? Like, so get that air flowing through. That was a line from the late Dr. Walter Crinian, one of my environmental medicine teachers, and just it hits home. So opening doors and windows, that can be helpful. Never drink or eat from plastic, particularly things that are warm, but plastic water bottles, these should be a thing of the past. We don't do that, right? That is exposing you to microplastics, endocrine disruptors. Staying away from those. Drinking out of stainless glass, ceramic only, even when you're traveling, as much as possible. And then, we could go have a bowel movement every day. I know nobody likes to talk about it, but move your bowels, drink plenty of water, clean, filtered.
No, I got to stop right there.
Yeah.
I was recently at the University of Michigan talking to their sports nutrition genius, shout out Abigail, and she had introduced fiber to a lot of the athletes, and they were coming up to her and they were like,
which does sound kind of funny.
Coach Abby, they're like, I'm pooping every day. And she's like, I know. And they're like, no, you don't understand. I've never pooped every day. And here are these 19-year-olds, 20, 21-year-old superstars who were going multiple days without eliminating. And they were freaked out because one kid came up and he was like in a panic. He's like, I pooped twice today. And, she was like, just wait until like the system starts going again, buddy. You're going to feel even better. So I just want to point on record for people that this is not crazy. These are the conversations I'm having at elite levels of sports performance where kids aren't getting any vitamins or fiber.
Oh, I'm so glad she's onto that. That's great. I mean, people think, oh, gross. It's like, what's really gross is when you don't eliminate. Like, that is just building up in your system, right? And it's causing the liver. It's so incredible. I mean, the body, I just have such a reverence. It's so amazing how it works. If we are not eliminating through our bowels every day, then there is something called enterohepatic recirculation. Again, the fancy word here. But essentially what it means is that you're taking the toxins that your liver processed yesterday, and because they're still sitting in your bowel, they're being reabsorbed into the venous system. They go back to the liver, and now the liver's got to take out yesterday's trash along with today's. And so over time, there's an accumulation, and we don't want to put that much burden on the liver. Then it starts coming out through our skin. Then it starts, that now the kidneys have more burden because we're not using those pathways effectively in a day and age when we have a lot of exposure to toxicity that we just cannot avoid.
So we have this sort of general environmental stuff. You've got to make sure and keep an eye on, making, peeing and pooping and doing, I think, the things that should be really normal for everybody every day, but keeping an eye on those things.
No one talks about.
And no one talks about. So what else? What are the other like top threes? And then we will actually start talking about your book.
Nutrients, well, this is all in the book. And nutrients are another really key piece. You cannot out exercise a crappy diet. You cannot out supplement a crappy diet. Really, we are what we eat, literally. And health starts in the gut. And if we don't feed the gut good stuff, or if we're adding toxicity to the gut, we're going to have leaky gut, which means leaky brain. We're going to be creating inflammatory pathways rather than regenerative and healing pathways in the body. And so diet is absolutely fundamental and totally crucial. And I recommend an organic ketogenic diet, not keto forever, but getting that metabolic flexibility, going back and forth in and out of ketosis. So I typically say to my patients, if you are experiencing cognitive decline, you want to be in ketosis more than you're not. And that is regenerative for the brain. It also allows the brain to use fats as fuel, ketones as fuel, rather than sugar. And as we age, all of us, regardless of diabetes status, become less efficient at burning glucose. So we don't make as much ATP per unit of glucose, and we're also become more insulin resistant in the brain. The brain likes burning, it will preferentially burn ketones over sugar. And when we burn ketones for fuel, it is detoxifying, creates less oxidative stress, and we get more units of energy for that. And so many people will have this experience of remembering their grandchildren's names after they get into ketosis. It's like their brain turns back on. And so I do recommend getting in and out of ketosis, very clean, right? A lot of the benefit, I think, of this comes from getting the processed carbohydrates out of the diet, the packaged, highly palatable, highly profitable processed foods that I think are really causing a lot of the chronic diseases associated with aging generally. And when we can say no to that, it's not easy. It takes effort. Society is set up for us to eat that stuff. But when we can say no to that, really focus on getting nourishing foods, high polyphenol, high fiber, less processed foods, we see improvements in every cell in our body.
I love it. Okay, so I'd love to go back to your book and talk a little bit more about the success you've seen in your clinic, because I think that you told us about the one story, but what other tell us a cool success
and describe
story.
your clinic, because I feel like
I would love to hear more.
I'm not sure that people even have a map for understanding resources that are available to them. Obviously, your book is going to be step one, power in the home and the household. That's what we see is just such a powerful loci of control. But oftentimes you think, okay, I'm going to go see my primary care physician, and it's not necessarily the best setup to try to understand where these things are going. So again, talking about your clinic and sort of the resource available, and then how you're playing offense.
Yeah, so I basically have 3 ways that I support people. And all of this has come out of people asking like, hey, I need this support. So I have a clinical practice. I'm trained and licensed in the state of California. And so we see patients in California and other Bredesen trained providers. There are thousands of us around the world. They are also available. You can, just Google Bredesen trained or Recode certified provider, health coach, nurse practitioner, doctor, naturopathic doctor, medical doctor, whoever you're interested in seeing, and whoever is geographically, licensed in your state. That's helpful. So that medical care is the testing. It's making sure you're on the right supplements, potentially the right medications. I'm a fan of hormone replacement therapy. That is something, there are receptors for sex hormones in our brain. You need a doctor who is trained in that and licensed in your state to be able to support you in that. And I think that is really good bang for your buck, but it also is expensive. It's not covered by conventional insurance typically. And so that is something that you need to pay for out of pocket, but I think is one of the best investments you can make in your health. Obviously I have a bias, but we have seen people improve their cognition and stay out of memory care by doing that. Then health coaching is also an incredibly amazing resource, because the foundation of this is lifestyle based. It's the choices that we make every day about what we put in our mouth, how much movement we get, who we spend our time with, and what time we get to bed. Those are the things that shift the trajectory of how well we age. And a health coach can help you with those things. So we do group coaching through my businesses, and we do it. It's when the magic is watching people encourage each other and watching one person get into the ketogenic diet, and for them to show up so much more present and engaged, and for that to inspire the next person to finally get the carbs out of their diet and really get on the program. And so we have group coaching that's available for people around the world. And then I've also created the first immersive experience. It's a residential care setting for the elderly, for people with memory care. And we're transforming memory care into memory recovery. The goal is that when
Love
someone
that.
moves into memory care with us, it's hard work, right? To change your diet, to change your exercise habits, to change, to get the supplements and take them at the right time, the right day, and all of this. Doing all of that and engaging socially, when we're stuck in our ways, it's hard. And when we don't have the support, I mean, this is hard for people with full cognitive capacity, let alone those who are already struggling with cognitive decline. And so when we
Right.
create this immersive, controlled environment and we do it for you, we hope to see really good outcomes so that you can move back home, so that you can return to independent living. It doesn't happen for everyone. It's not a guarantee, but we basically have these varying levels of support for those who are struggling. And so, oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, it's amazing to hear that because I do think most people think memory care is a one-way ticket.
Mhm. It often
A
is.
one-way street.
Yeah.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
way that it is designed, the conventional design for memory care, that's what we see is that people typically just decline. And a lot of that is because that's the expectation, right? And when we shift the expectation, when we engage differently, when we give people the support that they need to heal, we see that that's not the only possibility, that there is healing that can happen. Really, it's incredible.
So I would love to talk about everybody's least favorite subject because it's the killer of fun, and that is alcohol. And the reason for that is that Kelly and I have some people in our lives, including my own grandfather, who was the one diagnosed with Alzheimer's in my family, who was definitely an alcoholic. And
Oh, just 5
and
generations over here.
it seems that, this is a particular issue for baby boomers. Maybe our generation, Generation X, is starting to get the message that maybe, having 2 drinks a day is a bad idea. But what's your take? What's the role in alcohol in causing dementia or Alzheimer's or other, decline? Is there any science or literature to support that? And what's your sort of take? How do you advise clients when it comes to alcohol?
I'm pretty sure alcohol is neurotoxic.
I know. I mean, just,
So there's a 2-hour
setting in.
podcast by Andrew Huberman that goes into all of the details of this. And I had the privilege of chatting with him recently about it. And this, he was like, you can have a few like tequila drinks with no sugar a couple times a week, right? But it's pick your poison. Alcohol is neurotoxic, as Kelly said. It's like, this is something that if you are struggling with cognitive decline, there are things you have control over and there are things that you don't. And alcohol consumption is one of them. And now, one of the pieces, as you said that and talked about generations of alcoholism, one of the things that comes up here is trauma. Trauma, depression, anxiety, alcoholism is someone self-medicating. And so I have a lot of passion for people who have addiction issues and who struggle with alcoholism. I mean, and socially it's okay to drink, right? So there's often another layer of the alcoholism. Yes, it's neurotoxic, but also, like, do we drink to forget and then we end up with Alzheimer's? I mean, it's like dealing with trauma, I think, will be something that's sort of on the cutting edge. I was at a conference this last weekend and there were several of us talking about it, how with dementia and Alzheimer's, I don't know that everyone just experienced significant trauma, or if in the Alzheimer's population, early childhood trauma seems to be quite common and more common than the general population. So that when we're stuck in that fight, flight, freeze, defend, attack mode, when that's how our brain is programmed, cortisol goes up, and that is toxic to our hippocampus, the memory center of our brain. So there are direct links between high levels of stress and losing our memory as we age. And then the amygdala and the hippocampus are direct. You cannot separate them. We call them separate areas, regions of the brain, but they are right next to each other and they are directly linked. And this is that emotional memory center of the brain. Is the emotional center of the brain is linked to the memory center of the brain, right? It's an emotional memory center. And you can even think, most of us can appreciate this, thinking back to the day you were married, or like the day you won that medal, like those really highly emotional moments. You may remember all the details, right? What you were wearing, the way the sun was shining, who was there, exactly what they said. There's this really heightened level of a memory of that experience when the emotions are there. And that can, when the negative emotions are there, it can be sort of the opposite. We stop having the memories, we suppress the memories.
Yeah, and I mean, I appreciate you saying that because there is just a lot of conversation generally, like alcohol is bad, and any amount of alcohol is bad, and I think obviously we can all agree it's a neurotoxin, but to
A
actually,
fun
again,
neurotoxin
yeah,
sometimes.
fun neurotoxin, but to actually take a step back and say, hey, there's again to the root cause. Um, Most of the time, it's not the alcohol. There's something else underneath going on that needs to be addressed.
Yeah. And,
So,
just directly, I think many of your listeners probably have Aura rings or Fitbits or some kind of wearable. And you can see that after having drinks, your sleep suffers. And sleep is crucial to brain health. During sleep, during REM sleep, we consolidate memories, we take the emotional bite out of things, we emotionally process things. And during deep sleep, we have that glymphatic rinsing that helps us to get rid
Mm.
of toxins, whether they're normal metabolic toxins or the mercury that we had with our tuna fish sandwich or whatever. All of those things are coming out when we get into that deep sleep. And when we miss the opportunity for deep sleep, those accumulate. So one night of sleep deprivation leads to a measurable accumulation of beta amyloid in people in their 20s, 30s, and 40s in midlife. So you can imagine that night after night after night of having sleep deprivation, whether it's because of sleep apnea or alcoholism or night, working at night or whatever it is, shift work, that will
Netflix.
yeah, right. Yeah, binging Netflix, scrolling, doom scrolling, all of those things, if they're interfering with your ability to get good, high quality sleep, the blue light exposure, then that is going to directly negatively impact cognitive function and brain health.
One of the things that we say, and I think this was a Rutherford quote, who wrote a great book about genetics and trying to explain modern genetics to us. He said the brain is the most sophisticated structure in the known universe, and I love that. And we all added, well, it's attached to this physiology that is incredibly robust, incredibly sophisticated in a psycho-emotional environment that's probably an order of magnitude more complicated. So there have to be first principles,
Mhm.
right? In that, in 2.5 million years of evolution, like day night always has been happening for human beings. Things have changed radically in the last 10,000 years, except I'm a little fatter, your femur's a little longer, but we're pretty much the same humans of 10,000 years ago.
true fact.
um, you know, we often get a lot of pushback about sleep. I was on a podcast and saying, hey, that, we really have tried to divide the line of 7 hours and less is really like, you're barely surviving. That's like threatening state. And we're trying to get everyone to at least lay in bed for 8 hours, not be on their phone. And if you can't sleep because it's tricky and you have to rewire your brain and you've been doing this for decades, just laying there is the next best thing to sleep.
It
So can
helps.
you be asleep, lay in bed for 8 hours without looking at your phone? And right now we're deep in a project talking about youth and youth sports. And one of the things we see is that there's a direct correlation between poor sleep, lack of sleep, and injury in kids. And I just start to think, wow, if we really polled our families and ask how much our kids are sleeping, it's sub 8 hours. I work with a bunch of university kids who are getting regularly 6 and 5 hours of sleep. And I have to think these are teenagers in this state, start to let that process ride for decades and decades. Am I right that that's one of the most important things we could be getting our heads around and controlling, is just improving, not necessarily nailing, but just improving our sleep?
100%. I couldn't agree more. I think that from my perspective, working with dementia patients, I have seen over and over again thin women who have been told they don't have sleep apnea just by the way they look, who then go in, get their sleep studies, and sure enough, they come back with severe obstructive sleep apnea. They have cognitive decline. I had a woman who had a MoCA score of 8, so a single-digit MoCA score, highly progressed disease, completely dependent on her family to care for her, couldn't cook, couldn't get dressed on her own. And she got on a CPAP. That was the single intervention they really took control of. And her MoCA score went up to a 15 in 6 months. I mean,
Wow.
again, completely transferred. She was getting age appropriate gifts for the grandkids at the next Christmas after the year before being just like checked out. And even the cousins were like, what did you do to your mom? She's so much better. Got her on a CPAP. It was sleep. It was sleep specifically. And I've seen that over and over again. And I think that we could reduce the global burden of neurodegenerative diseases if we just got aggressive with addressing sleep issues. Treating sleep apnea is one of the obvious ones. And that's you can go through your conventional provider. You have to advocate. It's a total chore, but just get your sleep for anyone who thinks that they might have sleep apnea or has any cognitive decline, do what you need to do to get a sleep study done and then treat aggressively. I mean, mouth tape treats mild sleep apnea, but once you get beyond that, you need the oral devices or a CPAP or something. But to your point with kids, as I mentioned, one night of sleep deprivation measurably changes the amount of amyloid in your brain. And that's just what we're measuring, right? Cytokines, and there's so many other things accumulating. And particularly if those kids are ApoE4 positive, right? Now they have a genetic risk, and there's probably other genetic risks that make them less resilient to sleep deprivation. I love, you guys are athletes, and cold plunge and all these things. There's all these hormetic things that we can do: exercise, fasting, hot and cold therapies, even oxygen therapy can change VO2 max, and all these contrasts that we can do with pressure. Hyperbaric oxygen chambers work for this reason, right? The contrasting and pressure and oxygen, and all these things are hormetic, where we're stressing the system with the hope of getting more resilience, right? And the more resilient we are, that can be essentially like a proxy for health. That can, if we're resilient to stress, that means we're healthier and we can adapt to the environment. But with sleep, this is a no-go. There's no hormetic benefit to sleep deprivation. What we do is we decompensate.
Right. Well, and I mean, speaking of, this is for a whole other podcast, but we have this gigantic youth mental health crisis. And certainly there's peeps in the conversation about the sleep deprivation being a factor, but I think it should be like the headline in most cases, and it'd be really interesting to see how many diagnoses could be actually sleep deprivation versus whatever they're actually being diagnosed with. Who knows? That's for a whole other podcast. So we've been talking mostly about how to play offense, but I would, before we run out of time, at least try to take a couple minutes to understand some defensive strategies. And what I mean by that is, what should people be looking for in terms of what is cognitive decline?
What is cognitive decline? And is there an inventory where, as you said, hey, let's look for the big delta operators? I'm assuming that you've done this for us in the book.
Yeah. And also just quick, point of context, because this is where my life is, but all the women in my life are going through menopause, and probably experience some sort of menopause. We call it menopause dementia, but what is sort of normal, right? There has to be some normal amount of cognitive decline or menopause issues that aren't cause for concern, because it's just, we are aging and there is a process.
My brain is full.
Your brain can just be full, right? I mean, there's a lot of things that can be going on.
Right.
Right. So I think there's some normal stuff, but what is dysnormal? What should we keep an eye out for from a defensive standpoint?
Yeah. So, I think that our cognition should improve as we age. We're wiser, right? In some cultures and Confucius societies where we respect and appreciate our elders, that's what happens. So that is possible. We do not have to expect age-related cognitive decline to happen.
I love that.
It is not a given. And, you mentioned menopause. So what's normal? Yes, it's normal to go through menopause. And I am a naturopath, and I sort of assumed and was not really into hormone replacement. I came up through the Women's Health Initiative study. I understood that there was a risk associated. That has been put to bed. In May of 2024, there was a large study published. It was 11 million postmenopausal women over 65. They were Medicare eligible. So they were over 65, not just postmenopausal. And what they found was that hormone replacement therapy leads to a 19% reduction in all-cause mortality, reduction in risk for multiple cancers, including breast cancer, reduction in risk for heart disease, and a reduction in risk for dementia. And they didn't even talk about bone disease and osteoporosis, because that's just a given. That's so well established, they didn't even have to mention it. But this compared 9 million women who were not on hormone replacement with 1.5 million women who were, and showed that I basically at this stage think that as long as a woman tolerates hormone replacement, it is less risky to keep her from it than to give it to her. And that you do not need to worry about getting off of it as fast as possible, that you actually want to be on it as long as possible. And it's not these huge doses where women are cycling into their 90s. That, like a Wiley protocol, that actually wasn't what was best in what was published. It was the medium to small dosing that was best for getting these preventive health optimizing outcomes. So I'm a huge fan of that. And I didn't start there. right? I've come to that watching woman over woman, women after women in my practice, patient after patient say, my brain hasn't been the same since menopause. I haven't slept the same since menopause. Progesterone has a huge impact on sleep. We've been talking about sleep. When you go through menopause and you can't get that good full 8 hours of sleep, that affects, we talked about how that's going to affect your cognition the next day. Estrogen, there are estrogen receptors in the brain. There are pregnenolone receptors, DHEA receptors. All of these sex hormones have receptors in the brain, testosterone. And when we don't have any, the brain changes. And so replacing that as we age longer, one of the ways to age healthier is, I think, to use the benefit of bioidentical hormone replacement.
Awesome. So we've almost come to the end. I feel that we could probably go Huberman style and talk to you for 2 more hours, but we don't have time. Tell us a little bit about where your book is called Reversing Alzheimer's, and I'm assuming it's available wherever people can buy their books. And I know you're doing a lot of amazing programs. Where can people learn more about you, follow you on Instagram and so forth? Where can people?
Because we're all going to be there.
Yeah.
Like, hold on. I mean, obviously,
I think we really only touch the
if you have a
surface
woman
here.
in your family, you need to become a menopause expert. If you're anyone in your family is going to age, welcome to becoming an expert in brain health.
If you have
Brain
a brain.
health. So, we really only touched the surface today in this conversation. So I think there's probably we need to send people to learn more. So where can they do that?
Thank you so much. Yeah, Dr. Heather Sandison, Sandison is my last name, drheathersandison.com. We have a newsletter where we keep you up to date with all the science and share that, and also offerings about how we can support tips and tricks along the way to help you optimize cognitive function, really at any stage along the way. Instagram handle, dr.heathersandison, I think. Social media, there's a team who puts all kinds of stuff out there, and I'm so grateful to them.
And then one last thing, just from a resource perspective, and I think you mentioned it before, but to the extent that people, because I do know a lot of people are, wanting to sort of strike this balance between using traditional medical care when they need it for traditional medical care things, but also having, someone like you in their court. And how to, assuming they're not in San Diego, what would you recommend if someone's like, I'd love to try to work with a naturopath or someone who does the kind of work you do? Where do they begin? Where do they go?
Biology.
Yeah. Where do they start?
Yeah. So the Institute for Functional Medicine, Dr. Dale Bredesen, if it's Alzheimer's specific, Dr. Dale Bredesen, my mentor, has trained thousands of doctors around the world. You can Google Bredesen trained doctor in my area, or Recode, RECODE, Recode trained provider in my area. Health coaches, I think, they are powerful. They, again, it's those daily decisions that we make that seem small, but that add up over time. And health coaches are really well trained to optimize our lifestyle, which is going to have the biggest impact on our health. And then when you need that kind of icing on the foundational cake, I think that's when engaging and spending the money on finding a naturopath, a functional medicine doctor, somebody trained in that, or a menopause trained doctor, that can be very, very helpful. Conventional medicine is not set up to have, I see patients as a luxury. I see them for 90 minutes the first and second time we get together. And that's because, especially as people age, there is a lot to talk about. There's a huge amount of health history. I cannot do that in 15 or even 30 minutes.
No way. There'd be no way. Yeah, no way. Yeah. And I think it's just, that gives you the opportunity to be able to think critically and creatively. And I think what most of us want is to feel like our medical care is specific to us. Like my worst personal nightmare is like, we're giving you the standard of care. And I'm always like, I don't want the standard of care. I want like what's right for me. So I think working with you or someone like you can really make a difference for people. So Dr. Heather, thank you so much for being here and this amazing work you're doing on all fronts.
I can't wait to circle back around. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the work that you guys are doing, right? Like, again, brain health starts in utero, and working with kids and young adults to make sure that they are cognitively optimized. I mean, it's going to help all of us, right? Because we need those guys to take care of the elders among us.
So say we all.
Seriously.
Thank you.
True fact. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for being here.
Thank you for listening to the Ready State Podcast. If you like what you're hearing, check out all our episodes here or at thereadystate.com. And be sure to subscribe and leave a review on iTunes to help others find our show.
Check us out and follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at The Ready State.
Until next time, cheers, everyone.
You got it.